Into part two. Part two is steer, and we are going to look at chapter 5, which is the leap chapter. Minimizing the total time through the feedback loop. So chapter 5 opens up with the feedback loop and the process involved within that, and in order to maximize the potential, you need to minimize that total time through the feedback loop in order to find out whether you are going to have to pivot or proceed on your current path based off the feedback from the market. He also talks about the importance of the minimal viable product, the MVP, and how it is used with the loop to get the necessary information to either move forward, pivot, or dump the product. Sometimes that's the hardest thing for an entrepreneur to hear, is that it's their brilliant idea is not going anywhere and they need to dump it before wasting any more money. And that's how this feedback loop comes into play. Without it, a lot of entrepreneurs would continue to dump money into it without actually knowing if there is that need. And he talks about using learning milestones to accurately keep track of your progress. So throughout the process, and you putting those bug fixes and extra add-ons on, you want to keep these learning milestones to see, hey, are you doing better? Are you doing worse? After that initial pivot that you had to make, did things get better? Or are we still in the same boat? Or are things worse off now than they were before? That's what these learning milestones are used for. And then finding and identifying your startup strategy, which helps you ask the right questions. You can spin your wheels in the mud asking all the questions you want, but if they're not the right questions, it's not going to get you very far. And then this is the chapter where he talks about the Genchi Jimbutsu, which means to go and see yourself. You need to identify the problem firsthand. This is, don't always listen to what other people have to say. You need to experience your product on your own for yourself and see if this is really what you wanted. Is this really the path that you wanted to take? And do you think it's really going to work? At the end of the day, you're the entrepreneur. You're the one spending all the time to keep this going. You don't want to listen to what everybody else has to say. You want to constantly go back and see yourself and make sure you're doing the right things. Headed into chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the test chapter. Chapter 6 is all about the minimal viable product and how you need to constantly be testing it, how you put it together, and the main focus is finding the ways to improve it. And if it is, in fact, what the customer wants and needs, then to go along with it and keep making those adjustments to it. The minimal viable product is very important because it kind of allows you to jump right in, and this necessarily wasn't always the right method to get your product out there and to get people talking about it and getting feedback, because if it's really that bad, the idea is that people aren't going to try it again. When you make those fixes, people are going to be skeptical that it's going to get a bad reputation. But if you do things the right way and following the Lean Startup book and making sure that this minimal viable product is constantly improving and testing in the market to make sure that it's a need, that somebody's going to buy it, and if it's not, you put very little, or assuming it's a minimal viable product, very little resources into building the initial startup, building the initial product. So if it's something that the customer is not going to want, then you can just take it right off the table and make that major pivot and move somewhere else. Going back to the Kodak reference, I believe, within the book, Kodak sent out an online album that could be used for events and things like that, where everybody can go onto an online page and see all the pictures from the event. When they sent out their MVP at first, they had a lot of terrible reviews that there wasn't enough to it. It was very hard to use. It basically didn't work at all. But what they did find out is that there was a need, that there was customers out there that would use this, and then they could move forward with it and fix all those bugs that they needed to, instead of putting all this money into it and then finding out that the customer really didn't want it. So that's one way a minimal viable product can work in your advantage. And then we go to chapter 7, which is the measure chapter. And this states that a startup's job basically is to rigorously measure where it is right now, confronting the hard truths that every entrepreneur will see, and the assessments that it reveals. And secondly, to devise experiments through this scientific method that Eric proposes, and to devise these experiments to learn how to move the real numbers closer to the desired numbers in the business plan. Because you set out these timetables and projections of where you want to be, and you're either surpassing them or you're not hitting those numbers, and you want to figure out how to get those numbers closer to the actual numbers, the real numbers, closer to the desired numbers. And then he goes into the definition of a pivot. And a pivot is basically needed when the product has come to a standstill and there is no progress being made. And he determines a successful pivot is one that increases productivity and production and revitalizes the work in a positive manner. This chapter, he also gets into the cohort analysis, and that looks at the performance of each group of customers that comes into contact with the product independently. Each group is called a cohort, and the three MAs of metrics are actionable, accessible, and auditable. Here we go into the pivot or preserve chapter, which is chapter 8. And basically there's just a few definitions here. Vanity metrics is when is what prevents pivoting. When there is an unclear goal or hypothesis, there is no true destination, therefore there is no way to know whether it is time to pivot or preserve and move forward. So you want to stay away from vanity metrics as much as possible. You want to keep those clear goals, those clear definitions. Make sure that you're on the right path to reach those goals. Make sure that you have a solid hypothesis so that you can actually test. You can send your MVP right out to the market and have those early adopters look at your product and get all this back, but if you have no clear hypothesis, why did you send it out? That information isn't necessarily going to help you as much as it would if you had a clear definition of what you wanted out of it or what you thought was going to happen. And you always want to pivot sooner rather than later. Like I mentioned before, every entrepreneur that has had a pivot moment, they say that they wish they had done it sooner. sometimes you just get caught up in that seizure, and you don't really realize that your product needs to be reevaluated. And that is it for the review. Thank you.